We're going to wait a minute for everyone to get added to the webinar. We appreciate your patience. To everyone adding in, we're going to wait a minute to start the webinar so everyone can get added. We appreciate your patience. Again, we'll get started shortly. We're going to wait one more minute for everyone to get added to the webinar. And again, we appreciate your patience. All right, hello and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Tom Burke. I'm the Associate Vice President of Consumer Sales at Silversea Cruises. We're excited to have you join us for this session dedicated to our incredible expedition Arctic voyages. We're using the go-to format, so please send any questions via the question feature at the bottom of the webinar. We're using this versus the chat feature as it's private. We'll try and answer any questions you have, either using the aforementioned question feature, or we will save it for our Q&A session with our presenters at the end of the program. The presentation is going to be approximately 1 hour. We'll have an exclusive offer for all attendees, and we'll go over all details towards the end of the presentation. Now that we've got that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our experts that we'll be hosting today. Tim Am brings an extensive background in the expedition space, from serving as an expedition team leader for over 10 years to handling the myriad of operational aspects that go along with his unique vacation experience. Tim is able to add incredible insights on these bucket list destinations. Bob Simpson is one of the most respected names in expedition cruising. He has traveled all around the globe and has experience providing unforgettable adventures in this amazing region. He also provides a unique perspective because he has traveled to every corner of this tiny planet. Bob is invested in creating partnerships with all of our remote destinations, which enables Silversea to create a unique experience based on sustainability, community engagement, and development. Conrad Combrink is synonymous with Silversea and our expedition voyages. For those of you that have not attended our webinars previously, Conrad started Silversea Expeditions and is deeply involved in every detail of our expedition product. Conrad has visited every corner of the globe. He will share all of the reasons why Silversea is the world leader in expedition cruising. Conrad's team has curated the incredible itineraries we'll be diving into today. He has a deep passion for adventure and authenticity, and you will soon see how that translates to an unrivaled experience. And on that note, I'm turning this over to Conrad, Bob, and Tim. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and a wonderful good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon from a pretty muggy, overcast Miami. But it's really an honor for us to talk to you a little bit more about Silversea Expeditions, and I can't help but reflect sitting here next to my colleague Tim on the last 17 years of our journey. 17 years ago when we started Silversea Expeditions, the idea of a luxury expedition just didn't exist. And Tim and I were some of the first crew members on this journey. And truly, it has been a remarkable experience.
I couldn't comment any better. I think, well, I might have slid a slide in that you don't know about, but my journey started in 2008 with you up in the Arctic. That was actually one of my first deployments in expedition. So great to be revisiting this, and I'm so excited to be sitting next to the two of you because obviously in that time frame, my role within the organization has changed a little bit, and I now try wear a bit more of a sales hat than the operational hat that you wear. So I'm going to try and hopefully approach this and ask some of the sales questions to help understand this destination, this incredible area so much. Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up, Tim, and especially on the sales side, because that's where I started in this business as well. And I reflect in terms of expedition cruising, and it is, first of all, magical. It's spontaneous. It is unpredictable. We have to be able to adapt, and there's all these things that go into what makes an expedition voyage that are what make it so special. Yeah. And from a sales side, sometimes that's hard to actually sell. It's hard to describe. Yeah. You have to actually do it. You have to get out there and experience it, and that's
But the reality is, when you have a product like Silversea Expeditions, it makes it a bit easier. Talking a little bit about the sales, and then we'll move on into the destination. But when we look at Silversea Expeditions, we are so different in the approach that we take with our expedition and our expedition product development. Within Silversea, we have got an incredible amount of knowledge, not only on the ships. We have some of the very, very best skilled, qualified captains, navigational teams, expedition staff, but also in the office, the teams that actually develop these programs. It's unparalleled experience. We have got decades of combined experience, and combine that with our passion for expedition travel. I really think it makes a big difference, Bob, with our expedition delivery.
I do too, and it's not just that breadth and background of experience shoreside and what we're doing, and you know more better than anybody, it is the experience of the team on board, and that collective experience as well. And as many decades of experience as we have in this business, it's equal when the guests are on board in the company of these experts in this team, extensive team. We'll talk a lot about that, I know, of combined experience that's almost,
because it also translates, not only does it translate into an incredible experience for the guest, but it also translates into a very safe environment. And I mean, it better than anybody, having worked as expedition leader, that safety has to come first.
I mean, it's your biggest concern in every operation. You need to have that mindset. We are in just such remote parts of the world that, safety is first and foremost our primary concern.
And of course, we have got some amazing ships that we use.
I think we should dive in.
To travel to the Arctic. And as of 2024, we have got 2 ships that will be dedicated to the Arctic, the Silver Wind, and of course our brand new Silver Endeavour.
Yeah, and the other thing, when we talk about expedition, it's great to have that platform. It's great to have the services. Many of our guests joining today, I'm sure, have experience, whether it's on our classic fleet or even on expedition. You know what to expect in terms of the delivery in the Silversea experience. But I always look at this as the platform. It is that platform that enables you and the team to be able to do what they do and deliver the experience to the guests.
Yeah.
But it really is a floating hotel, and it's really giving us the opportunity to go to these incredible destinations. And for me, the Arctic is probably one of my favorite areas on our planet. It is so vast. It is so diverse. We are able to interact with local communities. We are able to go out on hikes. And the Arctic experience is just unlike anything else than we have in other parts of the world.
I agree, but I do like an analogy, and I think it helps. And I'm trying to speak from a sales perspective. The safari style nature of what we experience in the Arctic, where I know we've spoken about it a lot about Antarctic. I can tell you that if we go to Paulette or we go to a specific space, I can tell you how many penguins and what type of penguins. But the Arctic has so much more of that safari-like experience. You don't know where you're going to find it and what you're going to find. It's about going out and looking for it. So
and you know, you only have to look at the geography. You only have to look at the area to understand exactly why that is. You know, when we look at Antarctica, because we always get asked this question, don't we? We always get asked the question, what's the difference between Antarctica and the Arctic? And the reality is that these two polar regions they literally have nothing in common.
Yeah.
Even the ice is different that you encounter. And the Arctic is such a vast geographical area. Whereas although Antarctica, the continent surrounded by water, is a huge continent, the area that we visit, that we focus on, is quite small compared to the Arctic, where you have got Svalbard, the Norwegian fjords, Iceland, Greenland. You know, Greenland is a massive, massive island. Baffin Island, Northwest Passage, and what we are going to speak about today a lot is Greenland and the Canadian Arctic. And it's an area that not many people actually think of when they think of the Arctic. You know, traditionally people think of Svalbard to go see polar bears, but there's this incredibly untapped, beautiful Canadian Arctic and Greenland that in my mind is some of the most spectacular Arctic environments.
I think from my delivery of the Arctic, as you point out, you know, we've got these different regions, but the bit that we're going to be talking about today is, in my mind, often really the highlight. It's the wildest, remotest, most difficult to get to, least visited, and from a wildlife and scenic perspective, absolutely spectacular.
To get to this region, we start off in Iceland. We do. So we're going to walk through sort of a journey, kind of east to west. Number of different voyages, as you mentioned, both ships that are operating in this region. We'll talk a lot about the Endeavour, which is our new fantastic state-of-the-art expedition vessel, purpose-built expedition vessel. But we'll start in Iceland. But one of the things that I wanted to mention, I'm going to guess another element that is important for you, is again, it's not just about the wildlife expectation and dramatic scenery, but it brings it back to what's important for us as well, is these great communities and varied communities. So as we make our way sort of along the southern coast of Greenland, that's where we get that first opportunity, right? As we get into some of the, you know, the southern Inuit villages there, whether it's Karutak or you know, the Narsok and places like that are uniquely different. Each one, they have a different influence. They all came from the same origins ultimately, but have created their own different cultures and influence of.
But it really is, you know, as we make our way along the Greenlandic coast, it really is the scenery that is always so incredibly captivating. You know, you have this opportunity, whether it's on the ship, whether it's by Zodiac, to go through some of the most spectacular parts of the Arctic. And, you know, you always have a geologist on hand to talk about the granite peaks that we are going to see. You know, few things in life could be as spectacular as spending a day cruising through Prince Christian Sound, you know, on the southern tip of Greenland. I mean, you were talking about the villages, and of course we do spend a lot of time navigating along the coast, and these tiny villages are really scattered along the entire coast, south and west coast of Greenland. Now, although we visit them, of course, we spend a lot of time out in nature, and sometimes these small communities are the kicking off point for us for longer hikes and longer experiences.
Yeah. Particularly, I think the relationship to long distance hiking and the ability to actually get out and move a lot more, you know, with the polar bear threats as we leave areas like Svalbard or the high Canadian Arctic, where that's a lot more of a real threat. You know, the southern part of Greenland, you can generally check in with the communities and they can say, actually, we haven't seen a bear in a while, and know that it's quite safe to go out on an ice.
And you know, on that topic, I do think it is important to point out that Greenland traditionally, we will not find a lot of terrestrial wildlife like Arctic fox or polar bear. I mean, of course, the marine wildlife such as, you know, whales and so on and so forth, you know, we will find. But like you said, we can go into these villages, we can visit the museums, a fascinating culture. And what I find interesting with the communities is that from Greenland, so from Iceland to Greenland to Canada, even, you know, from Hudson Bay all the way up to the Canadian Arctic, how these communities are different in the way of life, because in the high Canadian Arctic, of course, you come across a lot of subsistence living, whereas a little bit more commercial down in Greenland. But even in these towns, I mean, I look at this picture that's on the screen, Kakartok, one of my favorite Greenlandic towns. Visiting the market, and you see all the meat and the catch of the days out there, and then going out on this. There's this hike, and I think you've done this with me. This is incredible hike that goes along this huge lake, absolutely
out behind the back of town.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
this is a much younger version of Conrad and Tim on the screen.
Yeah, that's 2008, I think.
One question that comes up for me quite often, and then it translates to both of you for your experience or time on board the ship in terms of planning these activities and facilitating the activities based on what each guest either is interested in, but also what their activity level is. And it goes back to one thing we talked about is the extensive nature, not just the experience and but the quantity of staff that we have, and the fact that on both of our ships we have a massive fleet of Zodiacs, our workhorse, that we're able to actually get the guests off doing different things, whether it's kayaking, whether it's on shore hikes, and then on shore you've got this diversity and variety of team that can take the guests on different hikes.
And places like this, when you go to places like Silversea, where it's one of the best examples of Viking history. And of course, we have historians, we've got archaeologists, anthropologists with us on the ship that will guide our guests not only on board the ship, but also shoreside. And as you said, the Zodiacs, the opportunity to use our Zodiacs to go into these smaller communities, and also the ships are extremely maneuverable, and because they are small, whether it's Silver Cloud, Silver Wind, or Silver Endeavour, we can get really close. We can get closer to the glaciers, from where we launch our Zodiacs. And we would be remiss not to mention the fact that Silver Wind has got a fleet of 26 Zodiacs, and in the polar regions, a group of 30 expedition staff that accompany our guests. That's an incredible ratio, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, I appreciate it. I'm wearing the sales hat, and you're giving me the great prompt here. I think one of the important sort of messages that you're making that I like to bring across is it gives us ability to just do so much more with our guests compared to others. And I'm not trying to knock other operators or anything, but just understanding how we've staffed and equipped our ships is such a fundamental part of how we deliver the product.
To your point, Bob, I mean, whether it is a hike, whether it is a Zodiac cruise, whether it is kayaking, the opportunities for our guests to choose and also to decide on their skill level. But I think it is important to remember that you do not have to be in top physical condition. You don't have to be able to climb Kilimanjaro to go on.
Good, because otherwise I wouldn't have been doing this for the last 15 years.
But I often actually say that when that question does come up is from a fitness standpoint, if you can walk up and down a flight of stairs.
Yeah, that's my exact benchmark as well.
So,
but as we work our way up the coast of Greenland, it really becomes more interesting, isn't it, Bob?
It does. And
hold on, I quantify that, because I think and I think we've done a really good job of pointing out the differences between the southern Greenland. It's got that Viking focus, it's got the small towns and communities, and I think that has a very definite appeal. Like some trips follow that all the way through to the Canadian Maritimes, following in that sort of Viking era and journeying. And I think that has a really strong story and community part to tell. I think it's different. It lends more of a wildlife perspective as we move further north. Sure. But I don't want to say that it's more interesting.
I think it's different.
Yeah.
And, when you get into Disco Bay, it's definitely one of my favorite parts of the world.
Yeah.
The fact that you go into Ilulissat, where we have the opportunity to go and see one of the fastest, if not the fastest moving glacier in the world. I think it's 19 kilometers a day.
That it's shifting, and it also draws back to sort of this learning experience, and the best way, in my opinion, is to actually see it and to visualize it. I'm always kind of fascinated when I am on board with guys like you and Conrad that have been there so many times or have been to these places for 20 years and can actually give a commentary or show pictures.
We've got our own
20 years ago. Look how it's changed in a place like the Greenland ice cap, how it's melting and generating. It's beautiful, it's stunning, but it's also a reminder of how things are changing and everything ties together in terms of the ecosystem.
We also, as we go further north, it becomes less about the communities.
For sure.
There's a definitive concentration in the south and in the Greenland and the west, and that's of course of much to do with
the currents,
the currents,
temperature,
the very warm Gulf Stream that comes in there and keeps this areas ice-free year-round, and of course that's why the communities there. But as we go further north, the ice starts playing a very important role in our expeditions, and in terms of your planning of the expeditions, you have to really take that into consideration.
And that goes into when we plan, right? The timing that we need to know very, very carefully how the ice might impact our voyages in these different places. But again, we had Umanak Fjord there, one of my favorite, that area, Fjord, Umanak Fjord. And again, it's just an amazing geologic, and there's so much geological history there that it is unlike any place else, really in the world.
But just going back to the ice and the planning around the ice, the fact that we have Silver Endeavour and her incredibly high ice classification and the technology that we have on that ship. I mean, she really is like a greyhound. She's fast, she's beautiful, she's rugged. But it does allow us to go into areas like Hudson Bay and Hudson Strait a little bit earlier than we traditionally would normally have gone in. And it does allow us to go into the area when we still have some ice and the ability that the ship has to push through this first year ice. It really opens up a new area for us.
It really does. And I know that's one of your absolute favorite places, the Hudson Bay and that region of the Hudson Straits, but very impacted on being able to actually get in, and specifically because of the ice and the early sort of expeditions. That was the route they thought they were going to be able to get through the Northwest Passage ultimately, and of course couldn't because of that. But to your point, it's great because it enables us to have a more expansive Canadian Arctic season by being able to start there a little bit earlier, and then we'll get into where we get up north into Baffin Island and Lancaster Sound and that area earlier than we normally would because we have the Endeavour.
I really think that few people consider Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait, and Baffin Island when they think of an Arctic vacation. And I really would encourage all our guests listening today to spend a bit more time looking at these expeditions because they are truly spectacular. You were mentioning earlier, you referenced, of course, in South Africa, you referenced safaris, but this is really for me like an Arctic safari. The diversity that we find in places like the Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait, and Baffin Island is truly spectacular because you've got your incredible geology, you've got incredible scenery, you do have the wildlife, and I think it is important to mention that, to your point, the wildlife is different than in Antarctica. And in Antarctica, we know, I can count on two hands the amount of species that we'll see, but it is the quantity that is so incredibly impressive. You know that when you go to Salisbury Plain in South Georgia, you're going to see 500,000 king penguins. You won't find that in the Arctic because you do have polar bears, you have got foxes, that you've got humans that all affect, but the variety of wildlife. And as an expedition leader, it's something that is really exciting because you have to use all your skills to find the polar bears.
Well, I think what's really nice about these Hudson Bay trips, and I know you've got the beluga on the whale here, which is absolutely one of the highlights of getting into Churchill. Obviously, Churchill itself historically is known for its polar bears, but it's because the Hudson Bay itself starts freezing from the south and then progressing north. So the bears are hibernating there. That's why they're getting put in the gel. But the belugas in the river and that Zodiac cruise, like from the moment that you basically arrive to the ship, you see it, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is incredible.
It's interesting that you mentioned Churchill, because it is also one of the more challenging places for us to start a voyage.
Yeah.
And our guests might think that, oh my God, how do I get to Churchill?
Yeah.
But they don't have to worry about that, do they, Bob?
That's
because we take care of that.
So with many of these voyages, of course, we're beginning or ending in very, very remote places. Churchill is an example, but we begin the journey in Montreal. Guests are staying at the Fairmont Queen Elizabeth, beautiful setting.
Yeah.
We charter the plane, we fly the guests up to Churchill, you embark the ship there, and you actually have some time, not just in Churchill before you board, but we spend a little bit more time in Churchill to get that experience with the ship as part of the itinerary plan. But again, rest assured, and our team, if you have any questions, they can answer in terms of the logistics. But
it's a great way to get introduced to the culture, isn't it? I mean, it's very different. Again, the Churchill and the experience that you'll have, and the interaction with the community, than in places like Cape Dorset, which I know is one of your favorite places.
Yeah, and we mentioned earlier how vastly different each of these communities are. One of the things that is quite consistent is the warm presentations, their artistic nature actually throughout the Canadian. We saw the Inuit art, soapstone sculptures, print art that guests can have the opportunity to acquire as well. But it's the warm greetings and the authentic greetings that we get from the communities as we arrive. And we talked about the importance of how we engage with the communities. And absolutely, it is paramount, one of our top priorities. We spend a lot of time. We go up and we visit. We engage. We don't go in and dictate what we want. We ask what is more important for them in terms of an experience. And the most important part of that to me is that translates to an amazing experience for our guests, but we want it to be a rewarding and amazing experience for the communities as well. So,
and Bob, I love that you talk about that, because from a guest perspective, I mean, we talk about how the Antarctic doesn't really have any of those cultural environments. So that is a big distinguishing feature between the two. And then just how important it is for us and the local communities to have that mutually beneficial relationship. From a guest perspective, I think is incredible.
One of the things that I love about the Arctic, and we've spoken about this a lot, is the fact, and as I referenced earlier, how vast it is.
Yeah.
And what I love about the Arctic is that guests can visit the Arctic again and again and have different experiences. As we transition from Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait, when we go further north up the Baffin Island coast, you get into some of the most incredible fjord systems on the planet. I know many of our guests have traveled to Norway, the Norwegian fjords, of course, absolutely beautiful. Down in New Zealand, Milford Sound, Dusky Sound, in the Chilean fjords, absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
But there is something so incredibly spectacular, so unique about the fjord systems, Sam's Fjord, Buchan Gulf, going into these incredibly narrow, deep fjord systems. You stand out on the deck of the ship and just
share,
Exactly. It's fun. I always also mention to our guests when we're on these trips, and you will know this from having spent so much time on the ships, that it's not just the experience when you're off the ship, is it? It's not just being out in the Zodiac. It's not just when you land. It is that entire experience. You have to look at it holistically. Be out on deck, be present, because it's when you're out on deck that you get to see these incredible sights.
It really is, and we talked earlier also about the timing, and of course we're for the most part we're on these journeys in our summer months, July going into August, and we have very few days at sea. I mean, we're in places where the visual experience is going to be unbelievable from. And I say sun up to sundown, and there's not.
There isn't a sun up or a sun up.
And that's one of the amazing parts about it is catch your cat naps when you maybe need to, but be out on deck. And at 2 o'clock in the morning might be the time that is the most amazing wildlife or visual experience. and we will make sure that we keep people updated with what's going on throughout the voyage. It is an expedition voyage.
I do think it is important that we talk about polar bears. You know, I think everybody that goes to the Arctic wants to see polar bears. We employ a large expedition team. We make sure that our staff are well equipped to spot polar bears. We have bear guards, we've got bear monitors. In fact, we go to great lengths in preparing our teams, you know, our operational teams. They take the expedition staff pre-season before they get on board the ship. They go through bear behavior courses so that we understand the behavior of the animals, because we've got a massive responsibility, not only towards our guests to keep them safe and of course try and show them as much as possible, but I feel very strongly about the responsibility that we have towards the environment. And you know, the reality is that we will never do anything to put any bear, any wildlife in danger.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think you've both served on the board of IECO at varying points in your career. IECO is the governing body, so to speak, or the tourism authority that administers expedition travel up in the Arctic, and they obviously set very strict guidelines for where we can approach animals, how we can approach animals, and I think it's well worth. As a comment, you know, I was just in a trade show in Vegas, and you know, all players in the industry have to abide by the same rules and regulations. So if one company is saying, "Oh, we're going to take you closer to a polar bear or something," they're either lying or they're breaking the law. So from a wildlife perspective, I think understanding again, and it comes down to how we've staffed and equipped the vessels, the incredible amounts of open space that we have on the decks, and then, you know, following within the rules. You know, I know you mentioned polar bears. I think that was a little bit of a segue that I wanted to just clear up. But can you talk about the types of trips or the areas where nothing's ever guaranteed in life other than death and taxes, but it's more likely or more common?
Absolutely. You know, I think when we think of the Arctic, the larger concentration of polar bears you'll find in the Canadian Arctic. You know, your chances in the Canadian Arctic, specifically Baffin Island, and then further down south towards Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait area, is probably the biggest chance. You know, there are 20,000 polar bears left in the wild, more or less, today. So the reality is we are not going to land with our charter flight in any of these destinations that we go to and have 100 polar bears lined up ready to be photographed. It's just not going to happen. If we see 5 or 6 polar bears on a trip, that's a very good amount. But I want to go back to the point that no matter where we encounter the polar bears, you know, the regional regulations differ between Svalbard, Greenland, northern Greenland, Canada, and how we can interact. Our first priority is to make sure that we do not do anything that will put the bears to disrupt them. You know, at the end of the day, it's a very short summer, and during the summer, the bears have got one objective: is to eat as much as possible and to get as fat as possible, so that when it becomes winter, they go into hibernation, or the males, they roam. They need that to conserve energy. So anything that we do that can stress them out could be the difference between life or death. And that is something that, as a company, I know this is something that the industry take very serious, but we place a lot of emphasis on that. And that is why each and every one of our expedition staff goes through a behavior course so that we can deeply understand. But we do see that. We do see
absolutely.
You know, it is like
I love this image because it shows, you know, one of the more common scenarios in seeing them, you know, just foraging along the shoreline. The sea ice is retreated that they primarily use as their feeding platform. And
absolutely, and this is where that sort of understanding and intuition comes into play as well, and sort of a precautionary measure. We typically have a good idea where they're going to be more likely to be, and that's where, if it's on shore, where there's a likely food source, because that's what they need. The best, from my perspective, and my best experiences have always been when we're actually out on the bow of the ship and they're on the sea ice, and we're at a safe distance, obviously, but it's an amazing, because that is actually their natural environment. They depend on the sea ice actually for survival. and also protection. In the Canadian Arctic, we talked about the range of the populations, 20,000 throughout the
Arctic.
If you take Russia out of the equation, it's even less. And then you've got Svalbard with the population. But in Canada, they still do have native hunting rights. And so that's another element that impacts their behavior, impacts their tendencies.
But it's we spend a lot of time talking about polar bears, but I don't want anybody to go to the Arctic just with that as the sole objective, because there's just so much more to the Arctic. Whether it's fin whales, whether it is you've mentioned the belugas is not only in Churchill, but in places like Buchenwald, there's great opportunity. I hesitate to say this, but also good opportunity for narwhal. Purposefully didn't put it into the presentation because create expectation, but also things like killer whales, all kind of encounters.
Buckhead, humpback,
exactly. But also the other iconic animal of the and again, you get to see all of these wildlife in the Canadian Arctic. And that is why I love the Canadian Arctic so much. That's why Baffin Island for me has to be top of my list. Baffin Island, Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait. And that's also why you will see us having more and more voyages in that area, especially now with Silver Endeavour, because we can get to places like Monumental Island, Lady Franklin Island, where again, nothing is guaranteed, but it's pretty much guaranteed to see polar bears and walrus on these places. And to our sales colleagues, please delete that so you don't hold me accountable. But we also go to places where we learn about the heroic age of exploration. And my hero, Roald Amundsen, is of course the first European that went through the Northwest Passage. And some of our voyages, we've spoken earlier this week in a different webinar about the Northwest Passage, but even just the northern part of Baffin Island, Bob, that's the start of the Northwest Passage.
Baffin Island, as we go along Devon Island, just north of there as well, and then Lake Hasher Sound. And the other is, my favorite sort of historical figure within the Arctic is John Franklin. A lot of that is just the mystery that represents and all that. But Beachy Island, where I know Ted, you've been, it brings all that to life. And I say that tongue in cheek because of course the entire expedition was lost in history. But we do find the remnants of the lost Franklin camp right there at Beachy Island. So our historian will be on shore with the guest and explaining the background, explaining the history. And it goes back to what I said earlier is these experiences, a lot of times it is the visual experience and being there and not just reading about it, but seeing it.
And it's also the learning about the more modern, the more recent history, as Canada was trying to protect the territory with the Canadian Mounted Police.
And so don't forget the whole origin of the search for the Northwest Passage was a commercial one. It was to find a more efficient route between Europe and Asia for trading, and so that real estate was always going back 250 years, extremely valuable, and it hasn't changed through the course of history. And as we progress into the 20th century and we get into the Cold War era in particular, and you have this sort of land grab dynamic between countries like Russia or China even and Canada in the US as well. The whole geopolitical dynamic is amazing. And we go to places like at Dundas Harbor, where not only you have the history of the Hudson Bay trading company and the outposts there, but you also have the RCP, the Mounted Police Camp, that was established specifically for that region because the Russian Navy was actually kind of dropping buoys to chart their boundary. And so in order to be able to legally claim the sovereignty, Canada had to establish either a military or a police presence, and that is how the camps were.
But isn't that the beauty of expedition travel? You're in this very remote, very stark environment, and you see this hut basically lying on its roof, and without the knowledge of our expedition staff, without the expedition staff that is purposely selected for these voyages and their knowledge of the region, it will just be a hut.
Yeah.
You know, but it's when you start really digging into it that you get to learn. I mean, and it's not only with the zodiacs or landing. You know, we go out with our kayakers, you know, and kayaking along the shores. You get to see a lot.
Sorry, and again, just the sales hat, because this comes up quite a lot. I know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question to how you two answer. I mean, obviously, the kayaking and things, they're all included. I mean, to speak to the all-inclusive nature of Silversea, I know that that's something that you've really been focusing on in terms of our ability to deliver everything all-inclusively without having to sell the kayak excursion. And I don't know if you want to comment on that.
So I'll take a first stab at that. And it's not just what we do on board, the experiences, but it's also, from my perspective, it is the things that really are necessary for guests to either need to do or what we anticipate they really will want to do, that we want to take care of for them. So it goes back to what we talked about earlier with the charter flights and the hotels, where you cannot get to Churchill or Kangerlussuaq in Western Greenland, or even Pond Inlet, the way that we do it, without it being organized where we can get the guests to and from the ship. So we take care of that all for the guests. But then on board and the experiences, absolutely. We want to make sure that we're providing what we think guests are really going to want to do. And that's what we focus on.
But at the end of the day, guys, you know, it's about sharing our love of this region. It's about sharing our passion with our guests. It's about taking our guests to potentially show them a muskox, to be out on a zodiac and see humpback whales along icebergs, you know, to be out on the bow of the ship, to your point earlier, Bob, and see a lone polar bear male out there, you know, roaming the ice, looking for seals. You know, it's about the possibility.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I can fact check him. You know it's a male because the neck can't have a collar over it. So I would have called you out, but you got it right. It was a male. Good job.
I would hope that after so many years I get it right. But you know, it's about the possibility to, with your expedition staff in a very safe environment, go out and hike in terrain and in scenery that is just absolutely mind-blowing. You could not even imagine it until you are there and living that experience. So you know, if I have to have a tick and say in terms of the Arctic, I would Baffin Island, Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait, absolutely high up on my list. In fact, I think one of my favorite itineraries is one that starts up in Pond Inlet. You know, we fly our guests all the way up into the high Canadian Arctic, Pond Inlet. It's a logistical nightmare. We charter 6 or 7 planes. It's 2 stops. It is it really sets the tone for an expedition. There's no other way to do it. And you start in Pond Inlet and you systematically work your way from the Canadian High Arctic along the coast of Baffin Island down to Hudson Strait, then across to southern Greenland and West Greenland, explore those beautiful fjords, those communities. And in Iceland 16 days later, it has to be one of my favorite. But let's switch gears.
Can I just, because there's one point that you made there, which I think is really important to understand. From my perspective, at least, why we do the incredibly difficult turnaround is that we don't have that many sea days on any of these trips. They are actually incredibly busy. There's a lot going on all the time, and we figure out the difficult logistics to maximize the time that we're in those areas.
Absolutely.
So I think that's an important distinction, because we could have sailed there and spent 2 days at sea and done a much easier turnaround and started in the same place, but then we wasted 2 days of our guest time. And I think understanding that we choose to operate in these difficult places is for the guest experience.
Well, it's also, I mean, to be very fair, it's also easy to make those decisions and then hand it over to
Yeah, there we go.
But the reality is that I want to switch. I want to switch gear to some. You know, it's an area that I think we all enjoy, but I know it's an area that's very special to you, and that's the east coast of Greenland.
I know it's a bit of a preface, but obviously, having spent so much time on the ships, you always get asked the question, you know, where's your favorite place? What's your favorite? So I've worked through several lists in my life, but talking about Scoresbysund, you know, the world's largest fjord system, of all of the incredible fjord systems that we've already spoken about and discussed, just from its pure magnitude, spectacular beauty, wildlife, and still that continuation of the history. You know, we've gone through so many histories from a European perspective, the Vikings, then the early Thule people. You know, we talked about the modern day sort of perspective, the age of discovery, and just that whole area is so full and rich of all of those experiences.
And the ice, sorry Bob,
Yeah.
but the ice, I mean,
Yeah.
you can.
The ice is the only place where you get the Antarctic sized massive tabular icebergs. You know, obviously the Greenland ice sheet where we're talking about Disco Bay, it's an incredibly quick, you know, fast degrading sort of glacial run, but the bergs themselves tend to break up quite quickly. But in Scoresby Sund, you get these incredible massive icebergs.
And you know, it's not just Scoresby Sund, it's what we do even beyond that.
Yeah.
And it gets to 2 points. One is, again, the capabilities of our Endeavour vessel and the ice class. The other is the timing, because we are now getting into later August, and this is the only time really that you can comfortably plan to get into some of these places, and not a lot of companies actually do it.
Yeah.
So we're getting up not just in Scoresby Sund, but even north, beyond Scoresby Sound to the national park and the Eastern National Park of Greenland, that we have to do a lot of planning. We have to permit, we have to get you know, our contingency plans, but it is a remote environment that is so subject to that ice dynamic. But the timing enables us to get to where few people actually go, right?
I also think it's important to just draw people's attention to the fact that it's extremely green.
Yes.
You know, you have
the marketing.
A lot of times when we go ashore, we will be walking on tundra, and you know, we quite often look for the big mammals, you know, the humpback whales, the polar bears, the big icebergs. But it's when you actually look down, you actually really appreciate, because you're in an Arctic environment, and for these incredible plants to survive, you know, and the botanists on board, of course, bring it alive.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's probably one of the massive contrasts between the Arctic and Antarctic. You know, just the amount of different flowering plants and things that you can see, and as you say, just the tiny little microbiomes that you get, and the rock formations that you get. You know, I think one of my favorite terms is troll bread, you know, from the permafrost and the freeze thaw that you get up in those areas. So just I mean, from, again, that unfortunate safari reference, you know, obviously everyone thinks of the big five, but then there's the little five as well, and the Arctic really represents that.
But let's be honest, you know, being out on deck, being out on the Zodiac, and watching a humpback whale breach is just one of the most beautiful things. Coming across an ice floe with Zodiacs and seeing a walrus, and then of course the bird life.
And I'm sorry, but it's not just the walrus. There's bearded seal, there's ring seal, there's hooded. You know, depending on where you are, there's a whole bunch of other marine wildlife that we could talk about.
You know, I think at the end of the day, the message that we have today for our guests is that whether you've been to the Arctic or not, I think the Arctic will draw you back. I think that nobody should compare it to a trip to Antarctica, especially our guests that have been to Antarctica. It's extremely different, but it is a spectacular, diverse, beautiful, interesting part of the world that, you know, keeps drawing me back every single year.
Yeah. I mean, I know you were there just this year. I think one other comment that I want to make, and I don't know, I mean, obviously there's a lot of intention to it, but a lot of these trips in sequence, in a back-to-back kind of combo, can really provide the best of both. They regionally vary so much. I mean, I think that's been a little bit of a topic of what we've spoken about, how different parts of the Arctic vary.
And we purposely designed some of these itineraries to do exactly that. I mean, you can start off in Iceland, make your way across to Greenland, southern Greenland, then go into Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait
from Churchill,
and that is a month there.
Yeah.
Or you can start in Churchill, go through Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait, into West Greenland, do the entirety of West Greenland all the way into the Canadian Arctic, and then do the high Canadian Arctic, and then come back down Baffin Island back into Iceland.